It is 1940. You don't wake up, you survive the night. The noise is still in your head when the silence arrives, a strange, heavy silence, almost as frightening as the bombs. Your hands are covered in dust. Your body trembles uncontrollably. You spent hours huddled up, counting explosions, waiting for the impact that might not come, or might come directly at you. When morning finally arrives, it brings no hope. It reveals what's left. Houses torn in half, streets covered in glass, smoke billowing. From places where, just hours before, someone slept. People emerge from shelters with empty stares, searching for familiar faces, trying to understand who will never return. And even so in 1940, English civilians began to walk, not with strength, not with confidence. They walked because their bodies still obeyed. Because stopping there, in the middle of the destroyed street, would be admitting the fear that had been stuck in their throats all night. Each step to the bus stop, to the factory, to the office, was taken with a racing heart, and the question that no one dared to say aloud, is this going to happen again tonight? This isn't beautiful heroism, it's controlled desperation. It's ordinary people trying to keep their heads above water while everything around them sinks. Working, at that moment, wasn't living normally. It was clinging to anything that still seemed to make sense. And this is where the story truly begins. Because facing the bombs was terrifying, but getting up after them, looking at the rubble and still moving forward, that required something that doesn't appear in photos, doesn't fit into speeches, and is almost never told. How do you think that an ordinary person finds the strength to leave home and go to work after spending the entire night waiting to die, without knowing if the next bomb would fall on their own street? That question changes everything when we understand what really happened in 1940. If this kind of human, real, and unvarnished story captivates you, like this video now, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters. There are details that are almost never told and make all the difference. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to know where you're following this story from, because it's not just about the past, it's about ordinary people pushed to their limits. In 1940, night was not an interval between 2 days. Night was the most dangerous time of day. When darkness fell, no one thought about rest. They thought about where to hide, who to take with them, which wall seemed sturdiest, which corner seemed least exposed. Sirens cut through the air, and there was no doubt what that meant. It wasn't a symbolic warning, it was a direct alert. Something was coming from the sky, and it was coming to destroy. People descended into makeshift shelters, not knowing how long they would be there. Crowded subway stations, cramped basements, damp corridors, hastily dug backyard, shelters. Children cried, adults tried to maintain some composure, but the sound of the bombs pierced everything. The ground vibrated, the air shifted, the body reacted before the mind. Each explosion brought forth the same silent question. And now, there was no way to get used to it. Every night, the fear returned in full force. The worst part wasn't just the sound of the bombs, but the intervals between them, the waiting, the brief silence that made the heart race even faster. Some people counted the explosions, others prayed, others simply closed their eyes, trying to disappear for a few seconds. Nobody really slept. When someone dozed off, they woke with a start, thinking the final impact had arrived. Time lost its meaning. Minutes seemed like hours, hours seemed like days, and there was something even crueler. You didn't know what was happening outside. You didn't know if your house was still standing. You didn't know if the street where you grew up still existed. You didn't know if the neighbor who went into the shelter with you would come out alive. Your imagination filled the voids with scenarios worse than reality. Your mind wouldn't stop, even when your body begged for rest. When, at some point, the explosion subsided and the sirens finally fell silent, no one celebrated. The silence was not peace, it was uncertainty. People stood still for a few seconds, listening, trying to understand if this was the end of the night or just a pause. Many only got up when they saw others move, not out of courage, but because staying there seemed even more unbearable. Upon leaving the shelters, the shock came quickly. Smoke in the air, the smell of burning, unrecognizable streets. Places that were part of daily life had vanished. Open walls, collapsed roofs, glass scattered like ice on the ground. Sometimes the silence was broken by someone calling a name that went unanswered. Other times it was broken by nothing, and that nothing said a lot. The night didn't end when the day began. It continued inside people, in their tense bodies, red eyes and hands that trembled uncontrollably. Even with the sky brightening, no one felt safe. The feeling was of always being late for something bad, as if the next bomb was still on its way, even with the sun in the sky. And it is precisely in this state, completely exhausted, sleepless, without guarantees, without answers, that these people needed to make a decision that seems absurd when you stop to think about it. A decision that was anything but simple, anything but automatic, because the night was over, but the day ahead demanded something that was perhaps even more difficult than surviving the bombs. And that's where the story starts to get even heavier. When morning finally arrived, it didn't bring relief. It brought reality. The first contact with the outside world was always a dry, almost physical impact. People climbed out of their shelters blinking, trying to adjust to the light, but it wasn't. The brightness that hurt, it was what it revealed. The street you'd always known might simply no longer exist. An entire building could have turned to dust. A common, banal place now seemed like an end-of-the-world scene. Nobody ran, nobody spoke loudly. People walked slowly, as if their bodies were lagging behind their minds. There was smoke in the air, a strong smell of burning mixed with dust, something that stuck to the throat and made breathing painful. Broken glass covered the ground. Bricks scattered, doors hanging, windows open to nothing. And in the midst of it all, people trying to understand what they were seeing. The shock came in waves. First, confusion. Then, the automatic search for familiar landmarks. My house was here. The bakery was on that corner. This building wasn't like this yesterday. Each step brought a different confirmation that something had been torn away during the night. Some people found their houses damaged but still standing. Others found only emptiness, and there were those who couldn't even get close because the entire street was blocked by debris. It wasn't uncommon to see someone standing still, staring fixedly at a specific point without reacting. They didn't cry, they didn't scream, they didn't move. Their body was there, but their mind was still trapped in the night. Other people helped without saying anything. An arm resting on their shoulder, a brief gesture, a shared silence. There weren't enough words for it. And, amidst the chaos, strange signs of broken normality emerged. A clock still hanging on the wall of a roofless house, an intact cup on a table exposed to the sky, a bicycle fallen, bent, where a door had once been. These small things resonated more deeply than the great rubble, because they reminded us that life had existed there just hours before. The fear didn't go away with the dawn. It changed form. Now it didn't come from the sky, but from the ground. Fear of finding someone wounded, fear of recognizing a body, fear of hearing a name called and knowing exactly who wouldn't answer. And at the same time, there was a strange urgency in the air, a silent need not to stay there for too long, as if remaining among the wreckage would be admitting the magnitude of the loss. People knew that this sight couldn't be gazed at for long. If you stopped to absorb it all, your body would give way. So many did the only thing possible. They looked away, straightened their dusty clothes, and began to think about the next step. Not the distant future, not next week, just what came next. And that immediately after wasn't rest, it wasn't mourning, it wasn't time to process what had happened. It was something much harder and more contradictory. Because after crossing destroyed streets and seeing what the night had done, these people still had to face the most disconcerting part of that day, something that, to an outsider, seems impossible to comprehend. And that's exactly where the story starts to get even more intense. After facing what remained of the street came the most difficult moment. Not the noisiest, nor the most visible, but the most internally burdensome. It was the instant when the person needed to decide what to do. Now, should she return to the shelter? Should she stand there trying to understand what had happened? Should she look for someone? Or simply move on? This decision wasn't made aloud. It happened silently, inside her head, while her body still trembled, and the night seemed endless. Nobody was thinking about grand ideas like patriotism or victory. That comes later, in speeches. At that moment, thinking was short-sighted, almost crude. What do I do now? And for many people, the answer came almost automatically. Not because it was easy, but because it was the only thing that still seemed possible. Going to work wasn't a plan. It was an anchor, something concrete on a day that had already spiraled completely out of control. Their bodies were destroyed. No sleep, no rest, no proper appetite. Their minds were even worse, filled with images from the night, sounds that insisted on returning, the fear that everything would repeat itself in a few hours. Even so, these people were beginning to move. They adjusted their coats, wiped the dust from their faces with their hands, checked if they still had documents, wallets, something that would give them the slightest sense of order. Small gestures, but ones that kept them upright. Going to work didn't mean the work still existed. Many didn't even know if the factory was still standing, if the office had been hit, if the store still had a door. Even so, the journey began. And this journey was made with heads down, not out of submission, but because looking around for too long made the body fail. The person walked focused on reaching the next block, then the next, as if the world had been reduced to small, bearable stretches. There was guilt mixed into all of this. Guilt for moving forward while someone had lost everything. Guilt for thinking about work when someone nearby was burying a family member. But there was also a strange sense of urgency, almost a physical necessity. To stop meant to think. To think meant to relive the night. And reliving the night was something no one could bear to do so early in the morning. Many people didn't talk. Others talked about trivial things, almost out of place. The weather, a delay, the transport. Not because it was important, but because talking about the obvious helped keep the brain away from what really mattered. It was a form of self-protection, a way to pretend for a few minutes that life still obeyed some logic. This collective movement created a strange force. You'd see other people walking in the same direction and think, if they're going, I can too. It wasn't courage, it was contagion. One pushing the other without saying a word, and little by little, what seemed impossible began to happen. The streets began to have footsteps again. Not many, not enthusiastic ones, but enough footsteps to say that the city was still breathing. And that's where the story takes a turn again. Because leaving the house was already difficult, but what these people encountered trying to get to work made everything even more absurd. Nothing worked as it should, and yet somehow the day insisted on going on. Arriving at work wasn't a relief, it was another shock. Often the place simply wasn't there anymore. Where? Yesterday there was a factory. Now there was a smoking hole. Where an office once stood, there were only crooked walls and papers scattered on the floor, wet, burnt, unrecognizable. People would stop for a second, staring at it, trying to confirm if they were at the right address, as if the mistake might be theirs. Sometimes someone would whisper, "This was it," and that alone was enough to make their bodies feel even heavier. When the building still existed, it was rarely intact. Broken. Windows, ripped off doors, damaged roofs. Inside, the scene wasn't any better, dust everywhere, a strong smell of smoke, overturned tables, damaged machines. And yet, people went in. They didn't ask many questions. They didn't expect clear orders. Each person did what they could. They cleaned a corner, pushed some rubble, tried to start a machine, separated what was still usable from what had become trash. There was no atmosphere for long conversations. Words were few, direct, almost dry. You okay? A nod, a silence that spoke louder than any sentence. Everyone there carried the weight of the night on their shoulders. Some had lost their homes, others had lost someone. Still others didn't know what they had lost, and that was sometimes the worst. Even so, no one sat down to think about it. Thinking hurt too much. The work itself was strange, irregular, full of interruptions. Sometimes there was no power. Sometimes there was a lack of materials. Sometimes there was a lack of people. There were empty chairs that went unmentioned, names that went unspoken. Each absence weighed heavily on the air, but no one stopped to confront it. If they stopped, they wouldn't continue. Exhaustion was hitting hard. It wasn't the usual end-of-day tiredness. It was a deep, accumulated burnout that made hands tremble and heads feel heavy. Some people made mistakes on simple tasks. Others stood still staring into space for a few seconds until someone called them and brought them back. There was no harsh reprimand because everyone knew exactly where it came from. It wasn't laziness, it was human limitation. Even so, something impressive was happening. Little by little, the place began to move. An engine started, a phone rang, a form was filled out, small things, almost insignificant, but which gave the feeling that the world hadn't quite ended yet. Not because everything was all right, but because there was still action, there was still function, there was still an immediate reason to keep the body occupied. Work became a kind of temporary anesthesia. While the mind focused on a simple task, it distanced itself from the images of the night. It didn't resolve the fear. It didn't erase the trauma, but it created a break, a short space where it was possible to breathe without thinking about the sky, the sirens, the explosions. It was little, but it was all one had. And while these people were trying to keep something functioning inside damaged buildings, another struggle was taking place outside. Because getting there had already been difficult, but keeping the city running required something even greater, something that didn't depend only on individuals, but on an entire system trying not to collapse along with the walls. And that's what starts to become clear from here on out. What almost no one sees is the actual physical condition. These people were suffering while all this was happening. It wasn't just tiredness, it was exhaustion, pushing their bodies to the limit. Many hadn't slept properly for days. When they did sleep, it was sitting up, curled up with tense bodies, waking at every noise. Their bodies no longer understood what was night or day. Their heads ached, their eyes burned, their stomachs churned. There were people working with dizziness, nausea, and cold, trembling hands since early morning. The body was constantly taking its toll. There were sudden drops in energy, dangerous lapses in attention, simple mistakes that would never happen in normal times. People dropped things, forgot tasks halfway through, needed to sit down for a few minutes to avoid fainting. And even that was done with shame, as if stopping for a moment was a personal failure. Nobody wanted to be the one who couldn't take it anymore. Hunger was another constant problem. Routine was already being affected by rationing, but after nights of bombing, eating became even more irregular. Many people left home unable to swallow anything. Others shared what little they had with co-workers. A piece of bread, a sip of warm tea, anything that would help the body keep functioning for a few more hours. The cruelest part was that there was no time for recovery. There was no concept of resting today to improve tomorrow, because tomorrow could be the same or worse. Fatigue wasn't resolved, it accumulated. Day after day, night after night. The body entered a state of constant alert, as if always expecting the next impact, even inside an office or a factory. Many began to notice changes in themselves: irritability, difficulty concentrating, a strange feeling of detachment from their own lives. Some people described it as if they were functioning without feeling anything. Others felt too much. Any loud noise made their heart race. A door slamming could cause the same fright as an explosion. It was the fear of the night invading the day. And yet, almost no one spoke about it openly. There was no room for long conversations about feelings. Everyone dealt with it as best they could. Some made dry jokes, almost without humor. Others shut down completely. Silence became a form of protection, not because there wasn't pain, but because there wasn't the energy to express it. What's impressive is that despite this extreme physical and mental state, the work somehow continued. Not at a normal pace, not with perfect efficiency, but it happened. And that wasn't because people were made of iron. It was because the human body, when pushed to its limits, finds strange ways to keep going, even when everything indicates that it should have already stopped. But this effort came at an invisible price, a price that wasn't visible in the destroyed streets or damaged buildings, but that began to accumulate inside people, and little by little, this silent wear and tear would show that maintaining routine wasn't just a matter of physical strength, but also of profound emotional resilience, something that was becoming increasingly fragile. To get to work, there was still an obstacle that is almost never imagined by those who look at this story from afar: the way there. There was no guarantee that buses, trains, or subways would be running. Lines were interrupted without warning. Tracks were damaged. Streets were blocked by debris, craters, or still burning fires. Even so, people left their homes without knowing exactly what would happen. As they were going to get there, they just needed to try. Bus stops formed almost instinctively. Small. Groups gathered silently, looking out onto the street, waiting for something to appear. Sometimes a bus would come with broken windows, packed beyond capacity, creaking as if it were about to fall apart at any moment. Nobody complained. Those who could get on, got on. Those who couldn't stayed and waited for the next one, if there was one. Transportation wasn't about comfort, it was about opportunity. Inside those vehicles, the atmosphere was heavy. Tired bodies, closed faces, clothes soiled. With dust from the previous night, the noise of the engine mingled with the distant sound of sirens that still echoed in some neighborhoods. Each turn raised the silent question: is this street still safe? The fear didn't come in the form of open panic, but as a constant tension clinging to the chest. The subway, when it was functioning, was even more laden with meaning. The same stations that served as shelter during the night now became passageways to work in the morning. People climbed the escalators, carrying with them the weight of sleepless nights in the same place. It was as if the body hadn't had time to change function from survivor to worker. Everything happened too fast. There were enormous delays. Some people took twice or 3 times the normal time to get there. Others simply couldn't make it. They returned home unsure if they had made the right choice in setting out. And some gave up halfway there, not for lack of will, but because their bodies simply wouldn't respond anymore. They sat on the sidewalk, took a deep breath, and tried to figure out what to do next. Even so, something amazing happened every day. The system never completely shut down. Partial, broken, improvised, but functioning. Drivers showed up even after losing their own homes. Employees adjusted routes on the fly. People got off far from their destination and walked the rest of the way through the wreckage. Each arrival at work was almost a small personal victory, even if no one called it that. Transportation became an extension of the daily struggle. It wasn't just a means of locomotion, it was a constant test of endurance. Each completed journey said, without words, that that person was still standing, still participating. The previous night had not yet defeated them, and when they finally arrived at their destination, many were already at their limit. The day had barely begun, and their bodies already felt like they had lived through an entire week. But, in that context, arriving was only part of the problem, because what truly kept everything functioning wasn't just the ability to move through the destroyed city, but something even deeper, an invisible mechanism that ensured that despite everything, people continued to fulfill their roles. And that's what begins to become clear from here on. As the days passed, it became increasingly clear that this was not merely the sum of individual efforts. Something bigger was happening, something that didn't depend solely on the strength of a single person. The entire city was being propelled forward by an invisible mechanism made of quick decisions, constant improvisation, and a discipline born more from necessity than from formal orders. Nothing worked as before, but almost everything found a way to function. Somehow, teams emerged where none had existed before. People took on tasks they had never done before. An office worker helped clear debris. A laborer guided lost colleagues. Someone assumed leadership without any title, simply because it was necessary. There was no time to discuss hierarchy. The criterion was simple. Whoever could act, acted. Whoever could help, helped. The rest came later, if it came at all. Basic services were maintained at all costs. Electricity was restored in parts of the city, while others were still smoking. Communication lines were hastily patched. Trucks diverted routes. Deliveries were redone. Schedules ceased to exist as a fixed rule. Everything was provisional, unstable, but still functional. And this minimal functionality made all the difference, because it gave people the feeling that some control was still possible. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. If the city came to a complete standstill, something would break inside that might be irreparable. Keeping things moving, even imperfectly, was a way to keep the mind occupied, to prevent fear from taking over everything. It was like holding onto a thin rope in the middle of an abyss. It didn't solve the problem, but it prevented an immediate fall. What's most impressive is that this machine made no noise. There were no applause, no fiery speeches or grandiose scenes. What there was were small gestures repeated every day. Someone opening a makeshift door. Someone writing down information on a dirty piece of paper. Someone making tea for colleagues who could barely stand. Simple things, almost invisible, but which sustained everything. At the same time, no one had any illusions. Everyone knew that it could all collapse at any moment. All it would take was one worse night, a more severe attack, a series of losses. This awareness made the atmosphere even more tense. Every day that worked was seen as something borrowed, not guaranteed. And perhaps that's why it was exploited to the limit. There was a strange mix of fragility and firmness in the air. Fragility because everything could end suddenly. Firmness because, as long as it didn't end, nobody was simply going to give up. Not out of exaggerated bravery, but because giving up seemed even more frightening than continuing. Continuing was familiar. Giving up was utter emptiness. And it is at this point that the story gains another layer, because keeping factories, offices and services running wasn't just a practical matter. It was beginning to become something psychological, almost instinctive, a way of saying, without words, that the city was still alive. But this choice had profound consequences. Consequences that didn't appear immediately, but that accumulated silently within people, waiting for the moment to exact their price. And that is exactly what begins to emerge from here. Over time, something changed inside. Not visibly, not overnight, but continuously, almost imperceptibly. People continued going to work, continued performing tasks, but they were no longer the same as before. Routine kept the body moving, but the mind began to pay a high price. The fear didn't disappear. It accumulated. It hid. And it reappeared at the most unexpected moments. During the day, many functioned almost automatically. They performed simple tasks as if following invisible instructions. The problem arose in the brief intervals. A louder noise made their hearts race. A truck speeding by reminded them of the distant sound of bombs. A common siren could freeze someone for a few seconds, bringing everything back with full force. Night seeped into the day, even under the sun. Emotions became unregulated. People became more irritable, exploding over small things, then silently regretting it. Others became strangely cold, distant, as if they had switched something off inside to keep functioning. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was a defense mechanism. The body found a way to continue, even if it meant losing sensations that were previously normal. The hardest part was not having time to process anything. There was no space for proper grieving, to talk about what had been seen, to cry calmly. The losses were absorbed as just another piece of harsh information for the day. Someone didn't come back. The chair remained empty. Work continued. This didn't mean a lack of pain. It meant a lack of choice. Stopping to feel everything at once would be unbearable. Many carried guilt along with exhaustion. Guilt for being alive when others were not. Guilt for continuing to work while entire families had been destroyed. Guilt for silently wishing that the war would simply end, no matter the cost. These emotions were unspoken, but they weighed heavily. They weighed on their shoulders, on the way they walked, on the lost gaze at random moments of the day. There was also the fear of the immediate future. Not of the following year, not of the end of the war, but of the next night. The question returned every day, without an answer. Will it happen again today? Working helped push that question to the back of my mind, but it never completely disappeared. It stayed there, waiting for the sky to darken so it could return in full force. Even so, something curious was happening. Amidst this profound psychological strain, small human connections emerged that took on enormous weight. A look of understanding, a simple gesture, a shared cup of tea. They didn't solve anything, but they created a brief feeling of not being alone in that chaos. These moments, though rare, helped to keep people on edge. But this emotional resilience wasn't infinite. Each day acted as another layer of accumulated tension, and little by little it became clear that simply maintaining the routine wasn't enough. Something needed to sustain these people beyond individual effort and daily discipline. There were external forces trying to hold everything together, organizing, guiding, trying to prevent internal exhaustion from turning into collective collapse. And that's where the story begins to reveal another level of this survival, less visible, but absolutely crucial. As the internal strain grew within people, there was a constant attempt to prevent everything from collapsing at once. It wasn't perfect, nor entirely efficient, but there was a real effort to maintain some order amidst the chaos. Information circulated, guidelines were given, teams were reorganized almost daily. None of this eliminated the fear, but it helped to give shape to what would otherwise have been just widespread panic. The authorities knew that simply putting out fires or removing rubble wasn't enough. The greater danger was something else entirely, the feeling that no one was in control. Therefore, even when resources were limited and responses were delayed, there was a clear concern to maintain a presence. Signs were replaced, notices were distributed, familiar voices appeared on the radio, delivering simple, direct, and repeated instructions. These weren't speeches meant to evoke emotion. They were messages to keep people informed and focused on the immediate situation. Civil defense was working at an exhausting pace. Men and women who had also spent the night under bombardment spent the day organizing rescues, marking dangerous areas, helping the homeless, and directing improvised traffic. Many did this without knowing if their own homes still existed. Still, they returned the next day, not because it was easy, but because someone needed to do it. This effort created an important feeling. You weren't completely alone. Even if everything seemed fragile, there was a structure trying to hold things together. For those walking among the rubble towards work, seeing someone guiding, cleaning, and temporarily rebuilding made a difference. It was proof that chaos hadn't completely won. At the same time, no one was mistaken in thinking that this solved everything. The flaws were visible, the slowness inevitable, the loss irreversible, but the simple fact that there was an organized response prevented fear from turning into total paralysis. It gave people something external to lean on, when their internal state was already at its limit. This balance was delicate. A single major mistake, a particularly violent night, was enough to put everything at risk again. Therefore, every small success, a street cleared, a transport line restored, a service resumed, carried enormous weight, not just for the practical result, but for the psychological effect. It was a silent way of saying the city still works, and this directly influenced people's behavior. Knowing that someone was trying to organize the chaos made many continue going to work, even when exhausted. Not because they fully trusted the system, but because it existed. Because there was something beyond individual effort sustaining that absurd routine. But as the days went by, it became clearer that this support was not infinite. The accumulated fatigue, the constant fear, and the emotional tension began to take a collective toll. The question ceased to be simply how to continue today, and became, how long is this possible? And it is at this point that the story gains even greater weight, because it shows that maintaining normality was not just resistance, it was also a silent risk, which began to manifest itself in ways that no one could ignore anymore. Over time, something became impossible to hide. It wasn't a destroyed building or a blocked street. It was cumulative effect of all that in people. The routine continued, the work went on, the services functioned precariously, but inside, much was beginning to crack. What was once effort became profound wear and tear. What was once tension became constant exhaustion. Some people would simply pass out in the middle of the day. They wouldn't faint dramatically, they would just sit down and be unable to get up for a few minutes. Others would start making dangerous mistakes, not out of incompetence, but because their minds could no longer keep up with their bodies. There were those who got lost on familiar paths, those who forgot basic tasks, those who stood staring at a wall without realizing how much time had passed. Human limits were being tested every day. Doctors began to see patterns: persistent insomnia, anxiety attacks, stomach problems, pains that had no clear explanation. People who had never been ill before began to seek help, but many didn't even have the time or energy for it. Going to the doctor seemed like a luxury when the world seemed about to collapse again that very night. In the workplace, tension was constant. Any small conflict would escalate. A harsh word, a delay, a simple mistake could trigger unexpected emotional outbursts. Then came the awkward silence. Nobody wanted to fight, but everyone was on edge. It was as if each person was carrying an invisible weight, and any wrong move could bring everything down. At the same time, there was a silent pressure to keep going, not necessarily imposed from above, but created by the situation itself. If you stopped, someone would have to take over. If many stopped, everything would stop. And the idea of total collapse was more frightening than exhaustion itself. So people pushed their limits a little further each day, even without knowing how much further was still possible. The cruelest part was that there wasn't a clear line saying, this far is enough, this far is beyond. Each person discovered their own limits through sheer fright. Some managed to keep going. Others broke down inside without anyone immediately noticing. There was no room for visible weakness, not because it was forbidden, but simply because there was no time to deal with it. And even in that scenario, something continued to hold everything together by a thread. It wasn't just organization, nor just discipline. It was a strange mix of fear, responsibility, and a deep sense that giving up would have even worse consequences. But this balance was fragile. One more push, one more particularly violent night was all it would take to put everything to the test again. And it is precisely there that the story begins to move towards a decisive point, because when the body and mind reach their limit together, the question ceases to be how to continue and becomes, what will this leave for later? The impact of that routine did not end at the end of the workday or at the end of the war. It began there and would stay with these people for much longer than any bomb that fell from the sky. As the weeks went by, it stopped being just a daily effort and started to become memory even before it ends. People still went to work, still carried out tasks, still held onto the routine with trembling hands, but something inside them already knew that none of this would be forgotten. Even without clearly realizing it, each day was accumulating like a deep mark, something that would remain there long after the sound of the bombs ceased. There was a silent awareness that this experience was shaping everyone. Children growing up too fast, adults aging in a few months, people learning not to get too attached to places, objects, certainties. Everything seemed temporary, everything seemed fragile, and this perception changed the way each person saw life, work, the future. Nothing was guaranteed, not even the next day. Many began to realize that the simple act of going to work had become something more than an obligation. It was a way of maintaining some control over one's own identity. You could lose your home, lose friends, lose sleep, but as long as you could still fulfill a function, you still felt like someone. You still had a role. You hadn't yet been completely swallowed up by the chaos. At the same time, there was a sadness that was difficult to explain, a constant feeling that something essential had been taken away and would not return in the same way. The laughter was shorter, the conversations more restrained. People avoided making long-term plans. They talked about today, at most tomorrow. Thinking too far ahead seemed dangerous, almost an invitation to frustration. The hardest part was realizing that this extreme adaptation had an invisible cost. The more people got used to the absurdity, the further away the idea of true normality became. The extraordinary became commonplace, the unacceptable became routine. And that was frightening, even if no one put it into words, because it meant that something inside them was changing forever. Even so, no one talked about stopping. The city moved on, the work continued, the streets were cleaned every morning as if it were just another difficult day. But beneath this functional appearance, an entire generation was being transformed by the experience of living under constant threat and still getting up early to meet deadlines. And without realizing it, these people were creating something that would only be understood much later. A silent legacy, made not of grand heroic gestures, but of repetition, resistance, and extreme adaptation. A legacy that doesn't appear in the headlines, but that explains a lot about what that country would become after the war. And it is precisely about this that the next point begins to reveal, when the impact of this impossible routine finally leaves the present and begins to echo into the future. When all this is viewed from a distance, it's usually summed up in a simple phrase: they held on. But that phrase doesn't capture what really happened. Because what the English civilians experienced wasn't just momentary resistance. It was forced transformation. Going to work after entire nights under bombardment was not an isolated gesture, nor something done by just a few. It was a collective experience that changed how these people came to see effort, fear, routine, and even the very meaning of normalcy. As the war progressed and the bombings gradually subsided, nothing immediately returned to its place. The streets could be rebuilt, the buildings could be erected again, but people carried something that didn't appear in official photos. The body remembered, the mind remembered. The mere sound of an airplane, even years later, still made many people pause for a second longer than usual. The habit of waking up on alert didn't disappear overnight. Many continued working as if nothing had happened, but deep down they knew they had been through something extreme. That absurd routine had created a more restrained generation, more suspicious of easy promises, less impressed by empty speeches. People who learned in the hardest way possible that stability can disappear overnight. And that when that happens, what remains is not beautiful courage, but adaptation. Work, which had previously been merely a means of sustenance, took on a different significance. It wasn't just about salary or job function. It was about keeping the mind occupied, keeping the body moving, maintaining the feeling that there was still some control over one's own life. This left its mark. Even after the war, this mentality remained present in the British way of dealing with crises, difficulties, and prolonged pressure. None of this meant the wounds disappeared. Many never truly disappeared. Some were simply pushed to the bottom, silently coexisting with daily life. But what was built there was something that can only be understood when you look at the details. The ability to keep going, even when everything tells you to stop. Not for glory, not for romanticism, but because stopping seemed even more dangerous. This story isn't about military victory. It's about ordinary people living on the edge and yet still getting up the next morning to fulfill a routine that no longer made any sense. It's about a society that was forced to function within chaos, paying a high price for it, but avoiding something even worse, complete collapse. And perhaps the most impactful thing of all is realizing that as these people walked to work amidst the rubble, they had no idea that they were building one of the most revealing chapters in British history. A chapter that doesn't appear in grand speeches, but that explains a great deal about resilience, discipline, and the real cost of enduring. Because after understanding this, it becomes impossible to look at that war or any other crisis in the same way. What did you think of this story? Did it change the way you see those mornings in 1940 and the ordinary people who silently endured them? If something here resonated with you, leave a comment telling us what impacted you the most, because these stories gain even more power when remembered together. If this content has captivated you so far, a like helps the channel continue bringing you human, real, and profound accounts like this one, and subscribing ensures you don't miss the next chapters. Stay with us because there are still many untold stories that deserve to be remembered.